Welcome to Justice Reloaded HD. Today's story begins not with a grand event, but with a whisper. A quiet moment between a little girl who hadn't spoken in months, and a waitress who chose kindness over convention. It's a story about a mother's love, a child's world beyond words, and how the softest voices sometimes carry the greatest power. If you believe that healing often begins in the smallest gestures, if stories like this warm your heart and restore your faith in humanity, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Justice Reloaded HD. Because sometimes, all it takes is one whisper to change everything. The rain had been falling gently since morning, brushing the sidewalks of Portland with a soft, steady rhythm. Inside a small corner diner tucked between a used bookstore and a closed-down barbershop, the world moved a little slower. The air was warm, filled with the scent of coffee, grilled cheese, and a faint trace of cinnamon from a pie that had probably been sitting on the counter since noon. Smooth jazz played low from a dusty speaker in the ceiling. In the far corner, past a row of empty booths, there was a tiny bookshelf with bent covers and faded spines, children's books that hadn't been touched in weeks. June Rivera moved through the quiet with practiced grace, her black apron tied neatly at the waist, a pen tucked behind one ear. She'd worked here long enough to know the regulars by name, to refill coffee cups without asking, to read moods the way others read menus. But she never lost the habit of glancing toward that old shelf in the corner. When she had a moment between tables, she'd crouch there beside a child and whisper stories in a voice soft enough not to disturb but gentle enough to enchant. No one really noticed, except the children. That afternoon, the bell above the door jingled with a soft metallic chime, and in walked a woman most wouldn't expect to see in a place like this. Madeline Carter was all sharp lines and quiet power. In her tailored navy coat and low heels, she looked like she belonged at a tech summit or seated behind frosted glass in a boardroom, not in a diner with cracked leather booths and sticky syrup bottles. But she wasn't alone. Clinging tightly to her coat was a little girl no older than 9, with headphones covering her ears and a sketchpad pressed against her chest like armor. Sophie Carter didn't look up, didn't speak, didn't make a sound. Her small fingers gripped her mother's sleeve as if the world outside that connection didn't exist. They sat near the window, away from everyone else. Madeline ordered in a clipped, polite voice. Grilled cheese for her daughter. Coffee for herself. No sugar. No cream. June didn't greet them the way she normally would. Something in the girl's body language, the way she flinched even at the faint clink of a spoon, told her this wasn't the moment for smiles or chatter. She simply walked over, placed the menus gently on the table, and crouched just enough to be level with Sophie's ear. Then she whispered, her voice as soft as the rain outside, "The green chair in the corner? That one's for princesses who like to smile." She stood, offered no further explanation, and walked away. 3 minutes later, Madeline looked up from her phone and froze. Sophie had slipped out of the booth. Headphones still in place, sketchpad still clutched tightly, she walked, slow deliberate, to the corner of the room. Then, without a word, she sat in the green chair beside the old bookshelf. No one said anything for a long moment. June, from behind the counter, watched quietly. Madeline, still seated in her booth, stared at her daughter with something between disbelief and awe. Because for the first time in months, Sophie had made a choice. A move. A step toward something. And it had started with a whisper. It had been nearly a year since Madeline Carter dared to take her daughter into any public place. The world, with all its unpredictable sounds and sudden movements, was simply too much for Sophie. Even with the noise-canceling headphones she wore religiously, Madeline could feel her daughter's body tense at every passing sound. So she held her close, tight, protective, as they stepped into the quiet diner on that rainy afternoon. Sophie didn't look up. She stayed tucked against her mother's side, eyes fixed on the floor, one hand buried in the folds of Madeline's coat, the other wrapped tightly around her sketchpad. It was just supposed to be a quick lunch. In and out. No surprises. No expectations. June Rivera noticed them immediately. But instead of greeting them like any other customer, She simply approached with care, her footsteps nearly soundless on the linoleum floor. She didn't ask for an order. Didn't speak aloud. She just placed the menus gently on the table, then leaned in, close to Sophie's ear. Her voice was barely above a breath. "The table in the corner," she whispered, "with the green chair? That one's for princesses who like to smile." June straightened and walked away, leaving nothing but a trace of warmth behind. Madeline didn't expect anything to come of it. But 3 minutes later, her daughter slipped out of the booth without a word. Still silent, still clutching her sketchpad, Sophie walked across the room, and sat in the green chair by the bookshelf. Madeline's breath caught in her throat. It was the first time Sophie had moved toward something, on her own, in months. And it had all begun with a single whisper. The next day, the rain had stopped, but the sky still hung low with clouds, heavy and uncertain. June was wiping down a table near the window when the bell above the diner door rang again. She looked up out of habit, ready with a polite smile, only to freeze slightly when she saw who had entered. Madeline Carter. Alone this time. Her presence was just as striking in the daylight. Tailored coat, hair pulled back, eyes sharp with purpose. She didn't sit. Didn't order anything. She walked straight to the counter where June stood, then paused for a moment, just long enough for silence to stretch between them like a held breath. "I need 5 minutes," Madeline said quietly. June nodded, setting aside the cloth she was holding. They moved to an empty booth near the back. For a moment, June wondered if something had gone wrong, if she had accidentally offended this woman somehow. But when Madeline sat, her expression was softer than yesterday. Still guarded, but softer. "My daughter," she began, her voice precise, as if each word was being weighed before it left her lips, "does not respond to people. She does not like strangers. She does not like noise. And for the last 8 months, she has not moved toward anything. Until yesterday." June stayed quiet. Madeline reached into her coat pocket and slid a business card across the table. It was heavy, embossed, the kind that screamed money. "I want to hire you," she continued. "I can pay you 10 times whatever you make here. All I ask is that you whisper to her, like you did yesterday. A few times a week. That's it." June blinked, caught completely off guard. 10 times her salary? It felt like something out of a movie. But even more surreal was the reason behind it. Not long ago, she had been reprimanded, criticized even, at the special education center where she once interned. They had told her her methods weren't structured enough, that whispering fairy tales wasn't a valid therapeutic approach. That connection had to be quantifiable, measurable. But June had always believed something different. She believed in softness. In gentleness. In storytelling not as therapy, but as invitation. "I'm not a therapist," she said, her voice barely louder than the stories she used to tell. Madeline didn't blink. "I'm not asking you to be." June glanced at the card, then back up at the woman sitting across from her. And suddenly, in the back of her mind, she saw the little girl with the noise-canceling headphones, slowly walking toward a green chair in the corner of the diner. Not because someone told her to, but because something quiet had reached her in a way nothing else had. "I'll do it," June said, almost to her own surprise. And for the first time, she saw a flicker, just a flicker, of relief in Madeline's eyes. June hadn't expected anything the first time she visited the estate. She had arrived with a borrowed umbrella, her heart pounding harder than it should have, wondering if this was some elaborate misunderstanding. Madeline's home was vast, quiet, all glass and marble and echoes. But the little girl waiting inside hadn't changed, still wearing her headphones, still holding her sketchpad like a shield. June sat across from her, just as she had at the diner. No lessons. No instructions. She whispered softly, the story of a princess who collected sounds in jars because the world was too loud. Sophie didn't speak. Didn't look up. But she didn't walk away either. And that, June thought, was something. On her third visit, as she was slipping her coat back on, A housekeeper stopped her at the door and handed her a folded piece of paper. She left this on the kitchen table. Said it was for you. June opened it in the car, beneath the gray Oregon sky. It wasn't a letter. It was a drawing crayon on printer paper. The lines were rough, but unmistakable. A green chair. A bookshelf. And next to it, a girl with long hair bending slightly at the waist, as if whispering to someone small and unseen. June's hand trembled as she held it. Sophie hadn't said a word. But she had listened. She had remembered. And most of all, she had responded in the only language she felt safe using. Her own. Every afternoon, just as the sun slipped behind the tall evergreens that lined the Carter estate, June arrived. She no longer wore her waitress apron. Instead, she brought with her a canvas bag filled with well-worn storybooks, scraps of ribbon, and a handful of crayons in a tin she'd saved from her own childhood. She never knocked loudly, just a gentle tap on the glass door, followed by the quiet sound of her steps crossing the marble floor. Sophie would already be at the long table near the window, her sketchpad open, a few crayons rolled out in a crooked line. She never looked up. She didn't have to. June never taught. She didn't speak in measured tones or follow a structured plan. Instead, she sat close, never too close, and began to whisper. Once there was a little cat who was scared of everything loud, she'd murmur, her voice barely audible over the scratch of Sophie's crayon. He lived in a quiet garden, where even the birds agreed to sing softly, just for him. Sophie never responded with words. But she stayed. And that was enough. The next day, June told a different story. This one about a princess who didn't like to speak, not because she couldn't, but because words always felt too heavy in her mouth. So she wrote instead. Letters, poems, even stories about other princesses who were just like her. And in her silence, she built a kingdom of meaning. Sophie paused her drawing halfway through that tale. She reached for a different crayon. Purple. Her favorite. And scribbled something new in the corner of the page. A single word, Guy. By the end of the week, there was another story. June described a faraway hill that only made music when someone sat still long enough to truly listen. Most people didn't believe the hill could sing, because they were too busy talking over it. But one day, a girl came who didn't say a word, and for the first time, the hill played its melody. That evening, Sophie opened a notebook she hadn't touched in months. Slowly, she wrote 4 separate words in blocky, unsteady handwriting. Cat. Chair. Quiet. Miss June. Madeline had been passing the doorway when she saw it. She stopped mid-step, her breath catching as if she'd forgotten how to breathe. She didn't say anything, afraid the moment might vanish if she made a sound. Because this wasn't forced learning. This wasn't therapy wrapped in charts or data points. This was connection. Real. Quiet. Undeniable. And it had arrived not through instruction or demand, but through stories whispered gently into the spaces where fear had once lived. For years, Madeline Carter had lived by numbers. Metrics. Outcomes. She had built a biotech empire on precision, on data, on things that could be tracked, measured, and projected. Progress, to her, was something you could chart on a spreadsheet. And healing? Healing had always been about results. So when therapists spoke to her about patience, about sensory pathways and emotional regulation, she nodded politely but focused only on the milestones. How many words per week? How many spontaneous gestures? When would Sophie speak? Fairy tales were never part of the plan. She had once said it, without shame or softness, I don't need fairy tales. I need progress. And yet now, almost every afternoon, she found herself seated beside her daughter, legs tucked under a blanket on the sunroom couch, her phone untouched, screen dark in her lap. June sat cross-legged on the rug, reading from a worn storybook about a squirrel who collected secrets in acorns and a girl who built a treehouse made entirely of silence. Sophie didn't look at her mother, didn't speak, but occasionally she would glance up at the pages, then return to her sketchpad and write a single word that no one had asked for. It wasn't therapy. It wasn't measurable. But it was real. One evening, Madeline was joined by Dr. Harris, a long-time educational consultant she had worked with since Sophie's diagnosis. He stood in the corner of the room, arms folded, watching as June read a story about a nightingale who only sang to children who never asked her to. After 10 minutes, he leaned in and whispered, "This is sweet. But it's not structured. She's just telling stories. There's no professional value in this." Madeline didn't respond right away. Her eyes stayed on Sophie, who was hunched over her notebook, coloring in a sketch of a hill with music notes dancing above it. Then she turned slightly, just enough for her voice to carry, but still gentle, like the room they were in. "Then tell me," she said, "why my daughter started writing stories the moment that woman walked into her life." Dr. Harris opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Because there it was, in crayon and silence and the slow, steady unfolding of a girl once locked inside herself. It wasn't data, but it was transformation. And that was something no chart could ever contain. The storm didn't begin with thunder. It started with a whisper, ironically enough. A single anonymous post, buried deep in a local parenting forum, surfaced late one evening and spread faster than anyone expected. The headline read like satire: "Billionaire mom hires waitress to whisper fairy tales as therapy for autistic child." No names were mentioned. No photos. But the details were specific enough. Portland, a biotech heiress, a little girl who wore headphones, and mysterious woman who told stories instead of using approved clinical methods. Within hours, the speculation swelled. Blogs picked it up. Then a minor tabloid. Then an influencer with too much time and too many followers. By morning, Madeline's inbox was flooded with questions masked as concern. Emails from board members. Messages from acquaintances who hadn't spoken to her in years. And worst of all, the tone they carried. Thinly veiled judgment wrapped in fake curiosity. Is it true you're experimenting with storytelling? Is this some sort of holistic PR stunt? Should we be worried about Sophie's care plan? Madeline didn't answer any of them. But she felt the ground shift beneath her feet. She read the post 3 times. Not once did it mention June by name. But the insinuation was clear. Someone close, someone inside, had spoken. And in her world, betrayal didn't come with second chances. That afternoon, June arrived as usual, carrying a new story tucked inside a hardcover book. The housekeeper opened the door, then hesitated before speaking. "Mrs. Carter would like to see you in the study." June stepped inside, sensing the shift in the air. It was colder than usual. Quieter, too. Madeline stood by the fireplace, holding her phone in one hand, the article pulled up on screen. "You saw it?" she asked. June nodded. "A friend forwarded it this morning." "You didn't talk to anyone?" Madeline's voice was calm, but tight around the edges. "No," June said quickly. "Never. I wouldn't." "Then how did they know?" Silence. Madeline took a deep breath, then closed her eyes for a moment, as if making peace with something painful. "I can't have this," she said. "Not the attention. Not the questions. Sophie's progress is fragile. I won't risk it." June felt the words before she fully heard them. Her throat tightened. "You're asking me to stop coming." "I'm asking for space," Madeline said, "until I can sort this out." June wanted to explain, to plead her case. But the look on Madeline's face, wounded, protective, exhausted, told her it would be no use. She simply nodded. Then, without another word, she placed the storybook on the side table, turned, and left the house. No goodbyes. No explanations. Just silence, again. And this time, it didn't feel healing at all. June didn't argue. She didn't send follow-up texts or call to explain. She had learned over time, that some walls couldn't be broken down with noise. They needed to be waited out, softly, patiently. But she couldn't leave completely without saying goodbye. Not to Sophie. So before she left for good, she walked into the library, where Sophie's stack of books still sat by the window seat. Near the top was a weathered copy of The Quietest Bird in the Forest, pages slightly bent from use. June opened it gently, somewhere near the middle, right where Sophie had left a ribbon between chapters, and slid a folded note between the pages. It wasn't long. Just a few words, scribbled in her familiar handwriting, soft but steady. A good story doesn't need to be shouted. It only needs someone who believes enough to keep telling it. She closed the book and placed it back exactly as it was. No envelope. No name. No need. As she walked out of the house for the last time, June didn't look back. Not because she didn't care, but because she did. And because she hoped that someday, Sophie would find that note when she needed it most. Not as a goodbye, but as a reminder that not all silence is empty. Some of it is waiting. The truth came not with an apology, but with a folder. It was the head of security who brought it to Madeline one morning, his face unreadable as he laid the thin manila envelope on her desk. "We traced the source," he said simply. "It wasn't Miss Rivera." Inside were timestamps, deleted emails, screenshots from an anonymous forum account. The post that started everything had been made from the IP address of a former housekeeper, someone let go months ago after a disagreement over privacy policies. She had overheard bits and pieces during June's visits and spun them into a story. A story that, to the outside world, sounded too strange not to share. June had nothing to do with it. Madeline sat motionless, her hand still resting on the folder long after the door closed. Shame rose in her throat like smoke. She had accused the one person who had asked for nothing. The one who had given her daughter more than any therapist, specialist, or consultant ever had. And she'd sent her away without giving her the chance to speak. She stood quickly, phone in hand, ready to call June. But something stopped her. A sound, not loud, but distinct. The soft scuff of slippers on tile. Sophie. Madeline turned and saw her daughter walking slowly toward the sunroom, a whiteboard in her hands, small markers clutched against her chest. She didn't say a word. Just moved to the window, where the light fell warm across the floor, and set the board on an easel. Madeline followed, saying nothing. Sophie uncapped a green marker and began to write. The letters were shaky but determined, like someone finding their voice all over again. Madeline watched each one form as if the strokes were cutting directly into her. "The princess is gone." She paused, looked down at the marker in her hand, then back up at the board. The next sentence came more slowly, deliberate and clear. "No one whispers anymore." Madeline's heart broke in a way that was both quiet and total. The room spun for a moment, not from dizziness, but from the weight of what she'd done. Sophie didn't cry. She didn't throw a tantrum or retreat into herself. She simply stood there, looking at the words she had written as if they belonged to someone else. A story left unfinished. It wasn't just a note. It was a plea. A confession wrapped in silence. And that silence screamed louder than anything Madeline had ever heard in her life. She dropped to her knees beside her daughter, her vision blurring with tears that came too late. All her life, she'd been told to follow evidence, proof, method. But none of those had ever reached Sophie, not like June had. Not like the stories, the whispers, the gentle presence that had never demanded anything in return. All Madeline could do was rest her hand lightly on Sophie's back and whisper, so softly she barely heard herself, "I'm so sorry." It wasn't enough. But it was a beginning. Because now she understood. Her daughter didn't need noise. She needed resonance. She needed someone who saw her. And someone who stayed. It took Madeline 2 days to gather the courage. 2 days of standing outside Sophie's door, watching her stare silently out the window. 2 days of seeing the whiteboard untouched, the green marker lying still beside it. 2 days of silence that no longer felt like peace, but absence. Then, on the third day, she got in her car and drove across town. No chauffeur. No assistant. Just her and an address scribbled on the back of a bill, Northeast Community Library. The building was small, old, with vines curling around the brick archway and faded murals on the windows. Inside, it smelled of old paper, tempera paint, and quiet. Madeline wandered past the front desk, down a narrow hallway lined with drawings, until she reached a door propped open by a crate of worn-out books. Inside, there were maybe 7 or 8 children, all seated on a colorful rug. Some were rocking gently. Some doodled on laminated boards. And in the center, crouched with a book in one hand and a scarf in the other, was June. She wasn't reading aloud in the usual sense. She whispered, slow and soft, pausing to act out moments with gestures, sometimes letting the children point to what came next. Her voice danced through the air like a lullaby you didn't need to hear with your ears, only with your heart. Madeline didn't speak until the story ended. June looked up, surprised, but said nothing. Madeline took a breath, stepped closer, and said in a voice much smaller than her reputation, "Sophie asked me this morning what story you were going to tell today." She paused, eyes damp but steady. "I didn't have an answer," she added, "because I've never been the person who made her ask about anything." June's expression softened. She closed the book in her lap, her fingers lingering over the frayed edges. "She's still listening," she said gently. Madeline nodded. "And I need your help again. Not just for Sophie. For others like her. For the ones who don't speak in ways the world understands." That was the beginning of Whisper Stories. They didn't plan it like a foundation. There were no boardrooms, no grand launches, no press releases. Just afternoons in libraries, shelters, classrooms, anywhere there were children who needed quiet, and someone willing to meet them there. June led the sessions. Madeline funded them. Together, they rewrote the definition of connection. They trained volunteers, not to speak louder, but to listen better. They brought in artists, therapists, and storytellers who believed in softness over structure. They created safe spaces where children could respond without pressure. With color. With movement. With silence. And Sophie came too. She never took the microphone. But one day, sitting beside a younger boy who refused to make eye contact, she leaned in and whispered, "The purple chair is for someone who's almost ready to smile." He didn't answer. Not right away. But 10 minutes later, he walked over and sat down. The room was quiet, but it wasn't empty. Soft rays of afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of the library's story corner, dust motes drifting lazily in the light. A semicircle of children sat on floor cushions, some swaying gently, some scribbling shapes into the air, others simply watching, wide-eyed and waiting. In the center sat June, calm as ever, holding a picture book open in her lap. And right beside her, small legs dangling from the chair, was Sophie. She wasn't wearing her headphones today. Her sketchpad rested closed at her side. She had a microphone in her hand, not the kind meant for volume, but the kind that sent her voice directly into the receiver of the child seated beside her. A boy no older than 6, his body curled inward, knees hugged to his chest. He hadn't spoken all week. Hadn't lifted his eyes once. Sophie leaned in, just a little. Then she whispered, slow and soft, into the boy's ear. "The purple chair," she said, "is for someone who's almost ready to smile." She pulled back, her voice having barely disturbed the air. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, without a word, the boy turned his head, just slightly toward her. His eyes found hers. And though he didn't smile, his grip on his knees loosened, just a little. His feet touched the floor. And slowly, almost like it surprised even him, he stood up, and walked to the purple chair in the corner. No one clapped. No one interrupted. They just watched. And June, holding the book in her lap, looked over at Sophie with quiet tears in her eyes. Because stories weren't just being told anymore. They were being passed on. If you believe that sometimes, the gentlest words carry the greatest power, please like this video. And if you want to hear more healing stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe to Justice Reloaded HD. Thank you for staying with us until the end. We'll see you next time.